Hi, and welcome to New York, Quebec, and the Water Route to the Center of the World. This is bonus episode 8, Figures and Factors of the Syncretic Frontier.
Today we have a very special guest, the very first for the podcast, a writer and independent historian specializing in British American military affairs of the 18th century. He received the George Washington Book Prize for his 2013 book, George Washington, Gentleman Warrior, which takes a fresh look at the dramatic and checkered military career of one of history's most pivotal figures. His first single-authored book, Redcoats, The British Soldier and War in the Americas, 1755 to 1763, was widely praised as a groundbreaking work. This was followed by The White Devil, which explored the truth behind the legendary exploits of New England Ranger Robert Rogers during the bloody French and Indian War of the 1750s. His next project was a biography, Paths of Glory, The Life and Death of General James Wolfe, which challenged prevailing views of its subject and won both the Charles P. Stacey Prize for Canadian Military History and Distinguished Book Award of the Society of Colonial Wars in New York. In 2020, Turncoat, Benedict Arnold and the Crisis of American Liberty won the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book Award in the biography category. I'd love to welcome to the show Dr. Stephen Brumwell. Thank you, Doctor, for appearing today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Absolutely. And so the reason for today's show, we wanted to discuss the figures and factors that best represent the syncretic nature of the frontier experience during the 18th century. Using Dr. Brumwell's wonderful catalog of works as our guide, we'll explore how the life in the frontiers of New York and Quebec produced a uniquely blended culture and peoples. So let's first start with Redcoats, The British Soldier and War in the Americas, 1755 to 1763. Now, I myself am a former AP teacher and high school administrator from New York City, so in creating these questions, I hope to closely tailor them to the curriculum and use them as a basis for further study and, exploration of our local culture here. So, first question, I find my students are often confused between the term America versus the Americas. How do you distinguish between the two?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Of course, the Americas embraces the entire American land mass, North and South America. Whereas many people, when you hear the term America, the focus tends to be on North America and specifically the United States. I think a very good example, I was thinking about this, in the movie, or the musical, I should say, West Side Story, you have key characters who are Puerto Rican. They are themselves part of the Americas, but I Want to Be in America, this famous song, Song America, they're talking
Absolutely.
about the United States, specifically New York City. That's what epitomizes for them America. So I think if we're looking at it from a historical perspective, as I have done in my various books, you've got to acknowledge the fact that the Americas is different, very different from specifically North America. And that's why I chose that distinction in the title of Redcoats, because the British Army deployed not only in what is now the United States, but throughout the West Indies. In the previous war, they during the War of Jenkins' Ear, so-called, they've been down on the Isthmus of Panama, Colombia. So we've got to look at the entire theatre of operations, if you like, extending beyond North America, including Canada, and much further south. Also, I think if we look at what historians refer to as the kind of the Atlantic, the British Atlantic, which of course embraces North America as well, the inhabitants of North America before the Revolution, people were very familiar with that area. It was all part of, where people who were trading, like Benedict Arnold in the 1770s, from his base in Connecticut, he was trading all the way down to the Isthmus of Panama, all the way across the Atlantic. So I think it's necessary to distinguish between continental North America, or the present day United States, and the far broader concept of the Americas, embracing also South America.
Absolutely. And I think, by decentralizing, our point of view here in America, ourselves speaking, of my students especially, it helps us, better grasp the interconnected nature and, how society had these tentacles, distributed all throughout, this, massive half of the world, how interconnected we truly were, and, how the United States has kind of recentered itself, in history through that way. And now, we take a step back and we can see just how truly global in nature, this Western Hemisphere was.
Yeah, I'd agree very much. And I think what we tend to forget is how important the Caribbean was, how
Oh, absolutely.
central it was to the policy of the British, the Spanish, the French. But of course, one of those Caribbean islands, in financial terms, because of its ability to produce sugar, could be worth, in terms of the eyes of politicians back in Madrid or Paris or London, could be worth more than a far larger mass of land on the continent, which is far less productive. That's why wars were often fought. Places like Havana or Cuba, I should say, were kind of basically used as checkers to be moved around the board when it came to negotiating peace settlements.
So the value of the West Indies, the Caribbean, is kind of lost on our students and the greater population nowadays, in terms of, just how economically viable and what powerhouses they truly were.
Yeah, that's very true. Of course, they've changed for the better, because those cultures were, or those kind of societies were, based upon slavery, slave labor producing the produce that made them so valuable. And of course, with the ending of slavery, the whole changing of the system of productivity, that the islands lost their economic value in European eyes. Yeah, and that's something, of course, a lot of other people have written about in great detail, this whole question of the establishment and the abolition of slavery. But I think if you look at it from a 17th and especially an 18th century perspective, that is why so much emphasis is placed upon sending huge armies to capture what seem to be just little blocks on the map. And often those armies end up losing a huge percentage of their manpower, because the troops and the navy sent there aren't acclimatized to that theatre, and they succumb to local disease.
Well, that's a great transition to our next question, because coming from another world, what were some of the initial shocks that might have shaken a recently arrived British soldier in the Americas, we'll use the plural, during the 18th century?
Well, most British soldiers, we know from looking at kind of regimental returns, that kind of evidence, that most soldiers were in their 20s. And given the sort of the gap between wars, most of them probably wouldn't have been active service veterans. So just the mere fact of going to a different world, a different environment, was a real eye-opener to them. Most British soldiers would have been familiar with cities. So if they ended up in somewhere like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, it wouldn't have been a huge change for them. And of course, the cultures in places like those cities were still overwhelmingly British, if I can use that term, in terms of they were English. Most of the people who lived there were of British origin. This was before the huge influx of people from Eastern Europe, Italy, even Germany, really, although you did have large contingents of Dutch, Swedes. So, but it wouldn't have been that wouldn't have been completely unfamiliar. But when you move from the settled seaboard to the interior, this is when things start to change, because then you're in an environment where the landscape is pretty much unsettled, and also you're coming up against people from a very different cultural background. In the West Indies, of course, you have people who are immediately plunged into an environment where, for example, the climate is very, very different. And I've already touched on the kind of the local diseases, which were so devastating for Europeans who didn't have any kind of immunity, which is
What were
why.
the casualty rates around those diseases on average? How much of a chunk of a manpower would they, degrade?
Yeah, well, a regiment sent to somewhere like, Barbados or Jamaica in a space of 2 years could lose kind of 90% of its manpower. So
Wow.
we know from the wars against revolutionary France in the 1790s, although the British Army did well in terms of securing objectives tactically, once they'd been there for a couple of months, the attrition through disease, yellow fever, other illnesses was catastrophic. And so it just became a bottomless pit. And people began to realize that we've trained up these troops to do a good job. And yet it doesn't ultimately matter because they, unless they take their objectives very quickly, there's no way you can actually hold these objectives. So it was a very different environment in that respect. But I think, yeah, then again, you need to kind of draw a distinction in North America, fighting in what is now the United States and Canada. Illness wasn't a big factor because the climate, apart from in the more extreme winters, wasn't different to what it was back in Europe. It was more overcoming the actual terrain and then dealing with adversaries who didn't follow your established code of behavior or methods of warfare.
Well, that's another great transition because while the colonial militia and recruits here in the New World, they were used to interacting with native peoples. How did the British regular army envision their use at the start of 1754, at the start of the French and Indian War?
You mean envisage the use of the militia?
Sorry, envision the use of native allies. While the militia and British colonists might have been used to interactions with the natives, how did the British Army, kind of view their role?
The British Army's, in terms of its own role, I mean, most of the British soldiers, for example, those who came over with Braddock, General Braddock in 1755, for them, Native Americans were a completely unknown quantity. And there'd always been this idea that, Braddock, for example, was completely ignorant of the importance of Indian, if I can use that term, allies, and didn't appreciate their value. Of course, that's since been thoroughly debunked. He did appreciate their value. I mean, people back in London knew that basically to operate in the North American wilderness, you needed to have Indian allies. And that's why Sir William Johnson was appointed as superintendent of the Northern Indians, or initially just for the American Indians in general, to bring tribes on board so that when Braddock launched his expedition and other expeditions for that same year were sent against the French, they would have a decent contingent of native allies with them. But for various reasons, it wasn't as easy to get those allies along with you as it seemed to be back in London. The various factors, the strife or the rivalries between individual colonies meant that they were basically seeking to corner the market in native allies for their own expeditions. And then you have strife between tribes themselves. The fact that the Iroquois Confederacy across what is now upstate New York were long-standing rivals with Southern Indians from the Carolinas, the Catawba, Cherokee. So if you were trying to get contingents from both of those tribal groupings, you could potentially end up with some kind of fight, an intertribal fight going on inside your own expedition. So it was by no means easy to say, right, we want you on board this particular venture. We are going to provide you with gunpowder, a load of trade goods, and send you against the French. So the British did appreciate the need for native allies, as the French did also, but it was far more difficult to actually transform that kind of desire into concrete moccasins on the ground, if you want to put it that way.
Now, was this a common practice for the British Army in maybe other locations around the world or in their history to install some sort of central interloper in terms of, I'm speaking of Sir William Johnson's role as, the Indian superintendent, head of affairs. Was that a common practice within the institution, or was that borrowed from colonial practice?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I'm trying to think of parallels from earlier eras where the British, or earlier the English, if you like, had found themselves in unfamiliar settings and had to rely upon local allies who were more familiar with the conditions, or, as you say, some kind of cultural broker like William Johnson, who was an Irishman but had come over, and he's one of these people who, there's a whole group of them who basically somehow seem to have this affinity with the frontier, even though it wasn't in their own background. So when they arrive in the colonies, the American colonies as they then were, they gravitated towards the frontier, quickly learned native languages, accepted Indians on their own terms because they wanted to trade with them, and they realized that if you're going to trade with people, you have to actually get on with them.
Yeah.
In the case of Johnson and there's kind of a small group of people you can identify from that 1740s, 50s period who ended up, because of their ability to become cultural go-betweens, ended up as scouts with Braddock, for example, like Christopher Gist, who is associated very much with George Washington, going out into the wilderness, guiding him in the Ohio country. He became a scout for Braddock. Also, George Croghan, another Irishman, who these guys kind of knew each other, but they shared this ability to move outside of their own cultural background, if you like, and to interact on the frontier. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about Robert Rogers, but he's another good example, I think, of someone who could do that. So going back to your original point, I'm trying to think of parallels from earlier conflicts, and it's really the French and Indian War was the first occasion I can think of where the British Army really was out of its element and had to rely on individuals who could somehow act as cultural go-betweens.
So they're really putting a premium on brokers, for the first time ever during this conflict. This is changing their entire approach, to warfare. They have to adapt and be able to tap into that existing network that is already prevalent on the frontier.
Yes, I think that's a fair point. I'm not suggesting there weren't previous conflicts where British English troops had to adapt their practices to local conditions, but I think this is where you see it particularly well defined. And also, by this period, we're entering an age where the sources are a lot stronger, if you like. There's a lot more evidence for the kind of interactions that are going on.
Now, is the British Army also looking at the experiences of the habitants and the coureurs de bois in the way that the French royal patronage network is established, and how there's these deep community ties, usually kin ties through marriage and blood, to these strung out native networks all the way through New France? Is that coming into play for the British Army? Are they looking at that sort of frontier lifestyle, or is William Johnson the go-between between those two worlds?
Yeah, I think one of the key distinctions between New France, Canada also going down to the Illinois country, down to New Orleans, and the English colonies along the eastern seaboard. When it comes to moving into Indian country, is the fact that the French are far better or far more willing to interact, intermarry. If they establish a trading post, they actually make connections in terms of relationships with the local native peoples. Whereas when the English, British do the same thing, their trading posts are really isolated depots, if you like, where they don't go out. The Indians come to them to trade.
Yes.
They don't go out. They're not paddling their canoes up rivers exploring the country. They're not going out on not usually. This is why people like Crowan especially and is an aberration. I mean, he takes a Mohawk Wi-Fi, I understand, and he actually has blood ties with the nations he's dealing with, which of course means that you learn the language, you learn the cultural practices, and if they see you as part of kinship ties, they're not going to, they're going to think twice before they plant a tomahawk in your skull if they get displeased with you. Whereas when the I mean, this is, I'm not suggesting there weren't, of course, individuals who bucked the trend, but if you want to look at trends, the French were far more adept. And you mentioned the Coureurs de Bois. The Coureurs de Bois were actually kind of, these were the people who, if you want to put them on a sliding scale of integration, these are kind of the guys who are on 9 out of 10, rather than the traders back in Quebec or in other places who are dealing with what the Coureurs de Bois bring back from their expeditions. These are guys who are actually frowned upon by the French establishment because they've gone too native and they're seen kind of wild, but they're tolerated because they perform a useful function, because they are bringing in the goods. And also, when it comes to a wartime scenario, these are people who are highly skilled guerrilla fighters because they have picked up a whole package of Indian skills when it comes to waging war.
And they can move much more easily through that territory due to their kinship ties, whereas the English, from what you're describing, seem to focus more on just economic ties without trying to delve too much into going native, if we can say, or establishing these blood or marriage ties. So it seems to be two different types of relationships that the two royal governments are trying to design here.
Yeah, I mean, without wishing to be too sensationalist or too controversial, I think there's probably also what you would call a racial element, a racist element in this as well. That the French, even down to the Jesuits who went out as missionaries, they accepted the Indians for who they were. They didn't try. I mean, whilst trying to, of course, promote Catholicism, they realized that if you were going to do it, you had to allow the Indians to retain elements of their own culture. You're not going to turn them into transplanted Frenchmen the way that the Puritans in 17th century New England had tried to basically just transform the local Indian tribes into identical Englishmen, not wearing, with no trace of traditional tribal culture left. Whereas, again, the French, most of the French who went out and were in Indian country didn't view the Indians with contempt or didn't see them as savages. Whereas there's an element of that thinking amongst English speaking traders.
Interesting. So now that we're speaking of native relations a little bit more, I want to delve into the Iroquois League. They wielded great power and exerted an immense amount of agency, demonstrated immense amount of agency. So as a major player in the French and Indian War, what were some of the League's foreign policy goals? What were they trying to, accomplish?
Well, before the French and Indian War, the Six Nations, originally 5 nations of the
Mhm.
Iroquois League, they'd already been aware of the role they could play in basically obtaining a certain amount of agency over both the British and the French because of their role in this strategic area and because of their usefulness as military allies. But pretty early on, the Iroquois had realized that going into full out war with the French, for example, wasn't a good idea, because the French had, they were increasing the resources they were putting into North America, and they were developing their own abilities to wage war in the wilderness. So basically, by the 1750s, the Iroquois, I think, were far more interested in just basically achieving a position where they could uh, just defend and maintain their own autonomy, their own freedom, by playing off the rival European powers and, in a way, exaggerating their own influence. And someone like Sir William Johnson, who had very close ties with the Iroquois, he was constantly building them up to far more influential than they really were. Yet by the 1750s, we can already see that the Iroquois, who'd been trying, for example, to exert some kind of imperial domain over the Ohio country, for example, weren't really able to do that at all. The local tribes in that region, who had gone there in the first place, in some instances, to escape from the tentacles of the Iroquois League, like the Shawnee, the Delaware, they weren't under Iroquois control as such. The Iroquois liked to think they were, but there wasn't a huge amount of reality to it. So I think the real,
Was it more like a client state
yeah,
relationship
I
in a
think
way?
so. Yeah, I think so. So there was this idea of, like, we're exerting authority, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit further on about certain individuals, but the so-called half kings who operated in this area were basically Iroquois nominees, if you like, but
Okay.
they didn't call the shots 100% over the local tribes. They were kind of tolerated, and they had to cooperate. So I think by the 1750s, although the Iroquois League, the Iroquois were important players, I think their key interest was in somehow playing off the Europeans against each other to guarantee their own position and their own freedom. And you see a similar situation arising during the Revolutionary War as well.
Well, we seem to cover a definite developmental progress, a relationship between the British government, the British armed forces, and the Native Americans. Despite these positive developments, how did British policy kind of fall flat at the end of the war and lead to this conflict in the Pays d'Oint?
Yeah, I mean, I think this underlines to an extent what I was saying before about this kind of balancing act. Once one of the players is removed, then what happens? There is no balancing act anymore. This is the scenario that develops at the end of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, basically 1763, up until the fall of New France in 1760. The British Army, through its Indian superintendents, including especially William Johnson, had been paying out a lot of resources in terms of trade goods to keep Indian nations on side, because they needed them as allies against the French. And the Indians had become used to receiving gifts of gunpowder, shot, which gunpowder especially, they didn't have any means of manufacturing themselves. So they were totally reliant upon the British and previously the French for gunpowder, for hunting and for warfare. So once the French were removed from the equation, the British, who were also at that time, by 1763, certainly seeking to make economies, because the war against France had been extremely expensive. And there were all kinds of plans put in to try and claw back some of the debt. And the commander-in-chief in North America, Sir Geoffrey Amherst, who was one of these people who just didn't have any affinity with Native Americans at all. He's been seen as, if you like, an Indian hater. Mm. He said, well, hang on, why are we paying out all of these gifts to people we don't even need as allies anymore? And he didn't understand that it wasn't simply about, some kind of contract. It was about respect. Yeah. Well, it was from the point of view of the natives, it was about, well, you respect us, we respect you. You show your respect by giving us trade goods, whether it's Strouds, blankets, good quality blankets, copper and metal kettles, decent knives, trade muskets, and of course gunpowder and shot. So your culture becomes reliant upon that relationship. When it's suddenly withdrawn and it's not explained to you in a respectful way, then that creates a lot of animosity. And this was a key factor behind what is known as Pontiac's War. And ironically, Pontiac's, the resistance, the Indian War of Resistance, which I think is what it really is, comes to an end, ironically, because of the lack of trade goods and gunpowder upon which such a war is reliant. And the various tribes who take part in it, eventually they become more susceptible to negotiating a peace because they want the gunpowder. And Sir William Johnson is a key player in explaining that Geoffrey Amherst has badly misjudged the situation. There has to be a give and take. If you want to end this war, you have to go back to the old relationship in some ways. You have to give the Indians something. Otherwise,
this diplomatic, lubrication through gift giving is just so incredibly essential.
Yeah, and I think what happened was that Amherst, although he was perfectly suitable for waging a kind of a conventional war in North America in terms of bringing about the surrender of New France, because he did not understand the cultural situation. He was one of these people, unlike Johnson, who just didn't realize that you had to be able to operate in that unfamiliar environment. He had no time at all for negotiating, and it quickly backfired. And it's interesting that you have the so-called the new boundary which the British establish along the mountain chain, the Appalachian running down
the Proclamation Line,
Proclamation Line, of 1763. That's basically imposed to try and keep settlement out of Indian tribal territory, and therefore prevent another kind of Indian War of Independence, which is extremely difficult to contain. Of course, as we know, the establishment of that proclamation line was one of the key factors which fed into the grievances of the English, in inverted commas, settlers on the eastern seaboard.
These mixed match expectations of, what it means to be a British subject, what the British subjects expected, what they thought their role was, and how they're viewed in this larger expanded imperial system. Definitely a great question. That's something I want to end the show on, obviously.
Sure.
So we'll get to that. But since we kind of did an overview of the British military experience, I kind of want to delve now into a more focused portion, speak more about Robert Rogers and these guerrilla tactics on the frontier. So we can move on to White Devil, a true story of war, savagery, and vengeance in colonial America. And we'll talk a bit about Robert Rogers here, because he's definitely one of those unique syncretic characters that stands out. So Robert Rogers, how did his upbringing shape his ability to incorporate various cultural attributes from native, settler, and old world, cultures? How was he melding all of these together.
Yeah, well, Robert Rogers, as you say, was an extremely interesting character. He's a very controversial character as well. But he was born in Massachusetts, not New Hampshire, as a lot of people assume. But he was one of these people from an early age seemed to, again, gravitate towards the frontier. He was someone who had experience in his teenage years of the kind of raiding that was going on in frontier territory. And he was someone who basically had, the kind of the character, the curiosity, the desire to actually go out on hunting expeditions, trading expeditions. Whereas I think what people tend to forget is that there was a huge difference between people who were living in Boston and were descended from people who've been living in Boston for several generations, for whom, life in North America was pretty much the same as life back in the old country. To people like Rogers, who was going out into territory where if he misjudged the situation, he could end up losing his scalp and his life. And in that kind of situation, I think, rapidly learn, or you have to learn, the skills which are necessary for survival, the ability to interact with people from other cultures. And I think one of the interesting things about the frontier, and it's something that became very apparent to me when I was researching White Devil, is that the frontier communities actually had a lot in common. When I say the frontier communities, I mean the sort of Scots-Irish or others who ended up on the frontier, and the tribal peoples they rubbed up against. It wasn't simply a question of continuous warfare. There was interaction, because these people had actually quite a lot in common. They shared similar values, which is why the white frontier folk, to call them that, were on the frontier in the first place, I think.
That always reminds me of that scene early in the movie of Last of the Mohegans, where they're on the frontier cabin and they're describing, essentially, we served as an indentured servant down south, moved up here. This was the only place available to this sort of family, to, people from our, class status. And how similar, that struggle might be, because the people, like you said, back in Boston also view those poor white settlers on the frontier with contempt.
Yes, exactly right. And so I think that it's not going too far to say that the Scots-Irish, as you say, the kind of people depicted in The Last of the Mohican, who of course come to an unfortunate end at the hands of a French and Indian raiding party, are quite an accurate representation. And also, I think it was very interesting, as you say, the motivation for being there. They'd done their stints as indentured servants and their time was up. Now they had an opportunity, but the only opportunity for poor folk is somewhere where you have to weigh the hazards of that environment against the freedoms that it potentially gives you. And I think that those communities, the kind of community that Rogers ended up coming from, meant that from a very early age, someone like Rogers, when you're a teenager, you're already like in a tribal society, by the time you're 15, you're already a man. You're potentially a warrior, expected to go out on raiding parties, and certainly a hunter. So I think there's a lot in common. And one of the interesting things about Rogers, although he's seen as this great nemesis of the Native Americans in the area, nothing in his writings suggests that he was in inverted commas, Indian hater. He wasn't. He used Indian native peoples within his own ranging companies. He was one of these people who wanted to learn as much as he could from the native peoples. And of course, this isn't unique in the 1750s. This is something that had gone back to the earliest days of the European settlement, English settlement in North America. If you look at the so-called King Philip's War moving forward to the 1670s, you have people like Benjamin Church, who's seen as a bit of a prototype for Rogers. who's already saying, look, if we want to fight the Indians, we've got to fight in their way. You've got to fight scattered. You've got to move in the woods. You've got to, there's no point using European style formations. If you want to beat the Indians, you also need to have on board native allies, and which is King Philip's War, as it was known, was basically ended because the English colonists were able to recruit sufficient numbers of native allies to actually counter the warriors they were up against. So these techniques go back a long way.
This is a cultural practice in the New World for many generations already, but it's kind of being taken to another level, given the state of warfare.
Yeah, Rogers refines it and he codifies it, and this is why when you get to Rogers' famous so-called rules for ranging. I think it's very interesting. There's all kinds of stories about these rules, and they've been sort of modernized versions of them have gained credence. I think one of them was taken from the Kenneth Roberts novel Northwest Passage, which of course was turned into a famous film with Spencer Tracy. And that was the version that ended up being used by the Rangers, the US Army Rangers in Vietnam. But I think what's interesting about that is that the key elements in those rules, and I've seen the original version, which are in the Loudon papers in the Huntington Library in California. Interestingly enough, when Rogers drew these up, he sent them to the commander-in-chief in North America, Lord Loudon, basically saying, this is kind of what I want to do. This is the kind of the ideal. And which Loudon could kind of basically comment on. But Rogers was coming up with universal concepts, if you like, in irregular warfare, which stood the test of time because they embodied essential truths which have lasted down the century and which were as relevant in Vietnam as they were in the backwoods of upstate New York in the 1750s. You know, essential truths that, you know, if you're marching somewhere, you don't bunch together. Marching fire, keep enough distance between each man that one shot won't take out two men, because even in the 18th century, a musket ball could go through one man and into another man. We've got lots of accounts of accidental discharges where someone trips, musket goes off, goes through two people, and then ends up wounding a third. So, yeah, the rules for ranging are very interesting. Because
so it's like a standardization of this colonial frontier experience that can be kind of used to build out the Rangers, you know, kind of to expand them. Is that Rogers' ideas behind putting this pen to paper here?
I think what he wanted to do was introduce some kind of like a code of practice. Okay. But as he himself acknowledged, that, you know, there are certain circumstances where whatever you know, or whatever you've read, you know, it's going to boil down to your own initiative at the moment, luck, and you just can't cover all eventualities. And Rogers' own career, I think, exemplifies that, because even with everything he knew, his experience, all the thought he put into it, there were situations where he ended up getting bushwhacked, suffering very heavy defeat. The battles, particularly the so-called second battle on snowshoes, where he was lucky to get away. And, you know, but that was, as someone, you know, as one of the British officers observed, you can't play at bowls without meeting with rubs, which is basically you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. You know, this is inevitable in this kind of conflict. It doesn't really matter. You know, there were no helicopters coming in to evacuate your wounded. If that's why casualty rates were so high. You know, if you ended up being surrounded 50 miles out from base in the middle of winter with no one coming to rescue you, you couldn't always, even if you could get away, you couldn't always get your wounded out with you. So given the nature of the warfare, you know, no one was going to take you back to, you know, hospital at Fort Ticonderoga and
it's unforgiving terrain and weather. I've been out on those lakes ice fishing during winter, and all of a sudden something comes up. And
obviously, you know, captives were taken, but often a situation, and Rogers himself, you know, in the original version of one of his reports, we knocked our prisoners on the head because they were too much of an inconvenience. Or if you're being attacked, same as Henry V at Agincourt in 1415, he had a whole bunch of French prisoners. Then another body approached. So what do? You don't say, "Oh well, stand quietly on the side, lads, whilst we."
Yeah,
you send a bunch of
that's a
archers.
fifth column in their mind.
So it was very brutal, ruthless warfare. And of course, when that report is eventually printed in British and American newspapers, the line about knocking them on the head is taken out. It doesn't. But people who were on the ground knew that this was a brutal, different kind of warfare. And this is
now speaking about like the brutal nature of this warfare, how did the Rangers' tactics tie into native practices around ritual capture, torture, even, you know, extending to adoption, the concept behind mourning wars? How did the Rangers kind of borrow that concept? I know it's a brutal, nasty form of small unit warfare, but why did the Rangers choose to, I'm not going to say indulge, but practice that cultural ritual?
Well, I haven't actually come across evidence of Rangers, for example, burning prisoners alive, this kind of thing.
Not to that extent, yeah.
By the 1750s, those kind of practices were even going out of fashion, if you want to use that phrase, with a lot of the tribes who've been in contact with Europeans. It was something associated more with, for example, the Ottawa, who were out in the Great Lakes region, coming to join the French armies as allies during the campaigns with the Marquis de Montcalm, 1756, 1757. We're seeing traditional ritual practices,
yes,
for example, like cannibalism and burning of war prisoners. There's several accounts of the aftermath of Braddock's defeat, for example, which mention this, and also in 1758 when the British initially failed to take Fort Duquesne, it's so-called Grant's defeat. We have eyewitness accounts there of a number of prisoners being burned, and it's really, it's not a widespread practice, but it's something which is still going on. But we have the French officer Louis Antoine de Bougainville, who becomes famous as an explorer. He's an ad to Montcalm during these campaigns, and he makes this comment that the Indians burned a captive just so, you know, they would remember how to do it, so they could. It was a way of like kind of so they wouldn't lose the practice, so they would know how to do it. So it suggests to me that by this stage, this wasn't really a particularly it wasn't a widespread practice. So the Rangers themselves, when they're coming back from burning St. Francis, the Abenaki village of St. Francis, where the evidence suggests that the women and kids there were killed along with such warriors as were there. When they were, and they'd taken a lot of scalps there as well. And of course, this whole issue of scalping, who invented scalping?
Yes.
It was indigenous practice pre-Columbus, but it was certainly encouraged because the Europeans paid scalp bounties. So if someone's going to pay you so many pounds or whatever for taking a scalp, if you weren't previously inclined to do it, then you would do it. And of course, the European colonies gave out scalp bounties for the scalps of native peoples. So this was something that by the 1750s had become established practice, because it had a financial factor to it, which subsumed
monetary value, supercharged the whole process, expanded it, maybe even so.
Yeah. People who wouldn't previously have taken scalps decided to do it because it was a way of, you know, buying rum or whatever. And so the Rangers certainly did that. And we know on the march back from St. Francis, which was extremely difficult, arduous, and, you know, a lot of the Rangers ended up starving. They ended up cannibalizing several captives. And that had never really been established 100% before I think I'm fair in saying I brought out White Devil. But when I was researching that, I came across the court-martial papers of a former New England provincial that's basically halfway between militia and a regular soldier, who'd been captured by the Abenaki 1756 and then had lived with them for 3 years. He was one of these whites who was basically assimilated into tribal society, had no desire to go back to had no desire to go back to Boston, I should say, in his case. And he ended up becoming amongst the most vindictive of those who dealt with captured members of Rogers Rangers who took part in that raid. And when he was subsequently apprehended, court-martialed, witnesses who testified at his trial, we know that some of the members of Rogers Rangers were killed because they were found to be carrying human flesh. Basically, they'd killed a teenage boy, and also it's likely the evidence suggests that they also killed the wife of the chief of the St. Francis Indians. And so, I mean, that practice was adopted in an extreme situation. It wasn't done as a way of ritually feasting to celebrate the demise of your enemies. This was done because of necessity. But the Rangers, of course, they included people who, I'm not suggesting they've been brutalized, but they were in tune with what were common practices on the frontier. But I haven't come across instances of the Rangers or anyone else deliberately torturing Native American captives. You do come across examples of, for example, after the Battle of Bushy Run in 1763, which was a British kind of victory, if you want to call it that, over the Ohio tribes, a captured Indian was just shot. And they say like a tethered wolf or whatever.
Oh,
but that's kind of, I would say, not like that I'm condoning it, but it's not
representative
No.
of the greater efforts.
Yeah, but you find throughout the history of the British, well, not just the British Army, but European armies, when they come up against native peoples. I was reading just recently about the very celebrated Battle of Rorke's Drift in the Zulu War of 1879, where the British garrison of Rorke's Drift repel a Zulu assault. But what happened to all those wounded Zulus who were left littering, hundreds left littering the ground in the aftermath of the battle? They were basically bayoneted or clubbed. There's no record of these people weren't taken into that famous hospital and nursed back to health. But then again, the Zulu themselves had the day before annihilated a British column at Isandlwana, where there were no wounded left on the ground. They were all richly disemboweled. So I think it's a kind of a, when you have these kind of conflicts involving warrior cultures of various kinds, or who don't really have the concept of taking prisoners, they themselves weren't especially surprised when people who they'd been fighting, who would have treated, say, the French or Germans very differently on a European battlefield, treat them as they treated others. I think that's...
So it's like a feedback loop almost, a tit for tat sort of thing.
And it's very, I don't want to go too off tangent, but despite the bloodiness of the Zulu War, again, this is a very interesting phenomenon. Zulus toured the UK in the aftermath of the Zulu War, and they went to Wales, where the 24 Foot, which was the outfit wiped out at one of the battalions wiped out at Isandlwana, had suffered very heavy casualties. These Zulus basically toured Britain like sort of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and they drew great crowds wherever they went, and they weren't vilified. They were they met with actually quite a welcome reception. So I find it very curious. It's something about, well, if you want to play big boys rules, then you've got to, if you want to play by those rules, that you accept the consequences. And I think that attitude was very much the one that played out on the frontier, upstate New York, Canada, during the French and Indian Wars. If you want to join Rogers Rangers and get paid twice as much as a regular redcoat, or this is, you have to.
Sure, you're out there doing in 3 feet of snow.
Why you're getting paid more.
Well, the last question with Rogers is, I wanted to address the praying villages and what was the village of St. Francis? How did it come to be, and why was it an important target of British war efforts?
Yeah, St. Francis, which is on the St. Francis River, which is just off the St. Lawrence, running south of the St. Lawrence, roughly midway between Montreal and Quebec. So this was somewhere where about 1700, the French had established a so-called mission village established by the Jesuits, so-called Black Robes, who basically were trying to promote Catholicism amongst the native peoples. But it began to attract Mohawks. I mean, people think of the Iroquois Confederacy, especially the Mohawk, as being more predisposed, sorry, I'll get it out eventually, towards the English, but that wasn't necessarily the case. The Jesuits attracted quite large cohorts of Mohawks towards settlements near Montreal, and by 1700 you start to see Indian nations, people like the Abenaki had originally been further south on the sort of mountains of Vermont, the White Mountains, but they're being pushed further north by incoming English settlement going up the Connecticut River, pushing forward. And what you get, I mentioned earlier, King Philip's War of the 1670s, which, the shock waves from that pushed New England tribes up into Abenaki territory. And then, the Abenaki themselves kind of displaced, push further north. So villages like St. Francis, which has its church, become like a focus for displaced native peoples. And of course, these native peoples have a grudge. These are people who gravitate into the French orbit because they hate the English. And because we were discussing earlier the differing French attitudes, the fact that the French were more tolerant, if you like, to cultural practices. So you could be a Catholic, but you'd still go hunting. You could still go and fight the English. You could still take scalps. You didn't have to lose all of your cultural identity. And of course, the Catholic religion, with its various rites, practices, rituals, which the Puritan-based New Englanders had kind of disdained and gone for a far more Spartan approach. That practice had far more in common with traditional tribal practices, if you like. So what you have is by the 1720s, 1730s, St. Francis already has a reputation as somewhere where the inhabitants, prolific raiders, they are taking captives from the New England frontier, bring them back. And of course, as we know, the chief of St. Francis at the time of Rogers's raid, Louis Joseph Gill, was himself the son of two white captives. He was white. He was known as the White Chief of the St. Francis Indians. But the fact that he was a white person ends up becoming the head warrior, if you like, of a native community, I find remarkable. And it just shows how it was a matter of accepting anyone as long as they were themselves prepared to behave, to conform to your cultural expectations.
There was a lot of, it seems like, fluidity and openness to a certain extent in this village that attracted, this disgruntled group of folks that kind of coalesced. They're a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but they all have this common, if you could say, hatred of, the English foe.
Well, also, I mean, this is a phenomenon which has been identified by people who've looked at this kind of cultural interaction before, the so-called white Indians. I mean, it's a very common pattern. For example, at the end of Pontiac's War, when it was assumed that people who'd been taken captive by the Indians back since Braddock's defeat would want to somehow come back to white society, because particularly children, they didn't know any other culture. They couldn't even speak English anymore. They didn't want to go back. They had to be literally torn out of the arms of their new families to go back to community. And then they ran away back to Indian culture.
Yeah, because it must have been such a shock, to get thrown back into an East Coast city.
I mean, if you think about it now, that is completely logical.
Yeah,
but also,
absolutely.
What it underlines is how the freedoms of native society, I don't want to exaggerate them, because I don't think you should paint this really necessarily as some kind of utopia, and there's a lot of hard work involved, particularly if you're a woman. But what it did mean, I think, was that for some people who were used to, for example, being an indentured servant or a labourer, or someone who wasn't in the elite levels of colonial society, tribal society compared pretty well to that. The fact that if you were a teenage lad, you'd go out hunting, you go out on war parties, you were treated with respect, or you could make a place for yourself on the basis of your prowess, which was valued.
So more of a meritocracy in a way?
Yeah, I think, this was certain people, I guess, if you put them in a frontier environment, I'm thinking forward to like the so-called mountain men of the 19th century. You go to an environment where you thrive purely on the basis of your own hardihood, ability to adapt and survive in a tough environment. You can see why, for a lot of people, that was an attractive option. And this was something that people in Philadelphia, New York, Boston couldn't understand. They could not understand why people would want to live with the savages rather than in a civilized environment.
So there's this juxtaposition of such, opposite world views, and so close to each other too, in relative terms, between the urbanized centers of the East Coast and the frontier. I mean, obviously transportation time took you a while to get there, but we can see that blurring, that line, that division line, isn't that far away.
Yeah. In terms of hundreds of miles, if you look at somewhere like Virginia, there isn't a huge distance between the Shenandoah Valley, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then you're on the frontier. There isn't a huge distance between there and, say, Williamsburg. It's even in the days before motorized transport, and if you're going on horseback, it's not going to take you too long. So I think that's an interesting point. But most people didn't want to cross that, certainly in the 1750s, before you have large-scale movements across the Appalachians. Most people weren't making that move. So you do have this very stark divide, whereas, people in Philadelphia, Boston would have seen Indians coming on delegations, this kind of thing, or even people in Williamsburg would have seen Indians, because if you wanted to consult with the governor of Virginia, you had to go to Williamsburg. He wasn't going to go out to meet you in your village. But these were seen as kind of curiosities. There wasn't like a widespread interaction. If you wanted to really interact with native people, you had to go there yourself.
Well, we kind of zoomed in on the frontier experience and looked at it through the viewpoint of the Rangers, and now I want to kind of go back out and move on to Paths of Glory, the life and death of General James Wolfe, and kind of look at the broader perspective here again. So with Wolfe, he's going to be growing up in this environment. He's going to feel the French royal threat, from a young age. How did this shape his view in terms of the transatlantic world being this battleground.
Yeah, well, Wolfe was born in 1727. So as a teenager, like a lot of British Army officers, he joins up when he's in his early teens. He's in action in Europe in the War of the Austrian Succession. So he fights at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743 against the French. Then in 1745-46, he's back in Britain. This time he's fighting against the Jacobites, the supporters of the exiled Stuarts, who are basically allies supported by the French. So he takes part in the battles of Falkirk and then the Battle of Culloden, which sees the military defeat of the Jacobite cause. Then he's back to Europe. In 1747, he takes part in this huge battle at a place called Le Felt near Maastricht, which most people have never heard of. But this was a battle of kind of Waterloo kind of scale proportions, huge casualty rate. But this was so basically, he's, by his early 20s, he's seen a hell of a lot of fighting against the French and French supporters, allies.
So he's already a grizzled veteran, in every sense of the word.
For him, the enemy is, France. And this is, obviously something which is in the English blood going right back to the 100 Years' War of the 14th, 15th century. Even, by Wolfe's stage, of course, people were familiar with the plays of Shakespeare, which celebrated people like Henry V. I mentioned him earlier in connection with the Battle of Agincourt. These were cultural heroes, icons. So people like Wolfe, to a certain extent, saw themselves as following in the footsteps of people who'd fought the French in previous years. So by the French and Indian War, not only for Brits back in Britain, but for transplanted Brits in the North American English colonies, France, and to a lesser extent Spain, were the traditional enemies. It's interesting when you think that, of course, it was only a few decades later that you had the War of Independence, but the War of Independence developed really quickly. And up until that point, really, I mean, men who fought in the War of Independence against the British, not least, of course, George Washington, had previously fought against the French in the French and Indian War. So when Wolfe comes over to North America to take part in the siege of Louisburg in 1758, for him, this was just fighting the French, the old enemy, in another part of the Atlantic world that I'd mentioned earlier, another zone of conflict where Anglo-French warfare was already a long established phenomenon.
So you mentioned the Jacobite rebellion, and I find that interesting because how could that possibly have prepared Wolfe for the sort of warfare that the French Corps de Bois, militia and their Indian allies might be utilizing, in this next war that he's going to participate in?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think you can establish certain links, if you like, between the Jacobite rebellion and later conflicts. One of the things that I don't think you can really draw a parallel with some kind of irregular warfare in the sense of having to go and fight people up in the mountains and things like this, because one of the interesting things that's been established is that the Jacobite army, everyone has this idea of, bearded Highlanders charging out of, down a mountainside with wielding broadswords, which did kind of happen on occasion. But the Jacobite army was actually far more conventional than people assume. A lot of the people who took part in it were lowlanders. There were also French regular troops who'd been sent over the Royal Scots and the Irish pickets, who were detachments from regular Irish regiments serving within the French Royal Army. And so basically, the Jacobite army did have a conventional element, and most of the men most of the manpower used muskets, bayonets, but there was an extra element to it in the sense that this device known as the Highland Charge, which we know was used at Prestonpans 1745, also at Falkirk 1746, which were both Jacobite victories, and also Culloden, where basically what it was you would advance to within close range, 40 yards or so, fire a volley of musketry and pistols, you draw your swords or axes or whatever you had, and then you would charge in at close quarters. And this was very effective against unsteady troops. At Culloden, where it was used, ultimately, as we know, the Highland Army or the Jacobite Army failed at Culloden. It wasn't, I think, because the tactics were ineffective. It would fail because, you know, the army was disillusioned. It was fighting on the wrong ground. It was heavily outnumbered. Most of the Jacobite Army didn't even advance to contact. On the one stage of the line where it did, it actually inflicted very heavy casualties. It broke the first regiment it encountered in this kind of very savage melee. Virtually all the casualties suffered by the Royal Army were at that point in the line. But for various reasons, most of the Jacobite force didn't even make contact. So anyway, the point I'm really trying to make was that the Jacobite army did have a kind of a tactical element that was different. And Wolfe, and he was at Falkirk as well, he'd seen this. But where I think there's a very interesting link was that this made a big impact on the British Army. And if you look at the tactics that the British Army itself adopted from the 1750s onwards, you have this emphasis on close-range firepower, most famously at Quebec, at the Plains of Abraham, where Wolfe, of course, was in command, followed by a bayonet charge. And this became the British tactical speciality all the way through to Waterloo, the Peninsular War of from in the early 19th century. This became the trademark British tactic. You know, you give volleys at close range, then you basically go in without really hanging about with cold steel. And I think this, you could see, I mean, it's very difficult to prove it, but given the timing and the fact that many British officers who used this tactic had fought against the Jacobites, I think the Highland Charge had a big influence on element of British tactics, you know, the tactics that won battles subsequently, not only at Quebec.
So another example of the syncretic nature of blending the old world and new world tactics together.
I think so. And also, it's very interesting to remember that just 10 years after Culloden, the British are recruiting Scottish Highlanders, some of whom are former Jacobites, who they previously fought against, into the British Army in large scale for use in North America. So you have Fraser's Highlanders, Montgomery's Highlanders. Of course, the Black Watch, the 42nd Regiment had already been established, but they were recruited, brought up, and ultimately 2 battalions. So 4 battalions of Highlanders are fighting in North America. And these
that's an acknowledgement, definitely, of the value of that.
That's an acknowledgement of the value of Highlanders. I mean, these guys were integrated into the British Army and they used the same tactics as the rest of the Redcoats, but those tactics had themselves been influenced by contact with what you want to call the Highland Charge, or the tactics encountered during the 45 rebellion. No one's ever developed that very much, I don't think. I mean, I've alluded to it in stuff I've written, but I think someone should write a PhD about that, or maybe someone is writing a PhD.
If you're listening out there.
No, but I think that would make a very interesting. And it's interesting that some people like Wolfe was accused of hating Highlanders, and no matter if they fall, is a famous quote. But again, you need to put it in context. When he actually serves alongside Highlanders at the siege of Quebec, he immediately says, "Oh, Fraser's Highlanders are the best, troops. The officers are the most manly corps of officers he served against," and he really values them. And of course, the Highland regiments go on to become iconic within the British Army.
Absolutely.
Right up to the First World War. It's so iconic that other regiments are starting to say, "Oh, how come, we were there too? How come the only people who are getting the press attention are the Black Watch? I mean, we were at Waterloo as well, And
Yes, Black Watch is very famous here in New York, starting with Ticonderoga and everything. So
yeah, I'm not saying that that reputation isn't deserved, but it got so high because of the distinctive appearance of the
okay,
Highlanders that other regiments started to think, oh, come on, uh, the glory, needs to be shared around a bit. And the same thing happened after the Indian Mutiny of 1857, where all of the most of the cultural representations tended to feature Highlanders because they looked so good, with their kilts and their bonnets and their bagpipes, and they entered into the popular imagination far more strongly than just your average khaki clad regular regiments.
now since we've addressed the way in which Wolfe clearly was able to adapt these tactics, I want to talk a bit about his death and how the public um how the public reaction to this death reflected this vibrant transatlantic connection. It seemed to tug at the heartstrings of both British American colonists and those back in the old world.
Yeah, I think the death of Wolfe is a moment which really does underline how we've got to forget this notion that somehow there was already a big gulf between a big cultural gulf or ideological gulf between metropolitan Britain and the colonists in North America. Basically, they saw themselves in 1763 at the end of the Seven Years' War. They'd never been closer together. And I've already alluded to the fact that the onset of the Revolutionary War, just 12 years later, really a lot of people were extremely surprised at how quickly this had come on. It was effectively
Yeah.
at that stage it was a civil war. You can't. People these days tend to look back on it as if it was like this inevitable fight between Americans and Brits, where at the time it wasn't that clear cut. But going back to the death of Wolfe, yeah, it's very interesting because Wolfe was a huge hero in the American colonies because he was basically seen as the guy who had uh, delivered the inhabitants of the colonies from that long-standing threat of the French. And the Wolf of Death, of course, is prefigured the previous year by the death of Lord Howe, killed at Ticonderoga. And of course, the difference between Howe and Wolfe is that Howe was killed just before a colossal defeat. If he'd been killed a couple of days before what turned out to be a huge victory, of course, he would have been far more celebrated, far more iconic as some kind of imperial martyr. Whereas Wolfe dies in the hour of victory, which immediately makes him more iconic. Even before Benjamin West's famous painting came out in 1770, off the top of my head, there had been paintings of Wolfe which became very embedded in culture in North America. Interesting examples: Israel Putnam, who'd fought as a ranger in the French and Indian War and in the provincial forces of Connecticut, he subsequently ran a tavern which was called the General Wolfe. And it has on the tavern sign, which still survives in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, that tavern sign is still there. And the design on the tavern is based upon a famous painting which was originally produced by one of Wolfe's aides de camps, based on a sketch taken during the siege of Quebec. Now, this design was obviously very popular because I've seen it reproduced in all kinds of versions, a very crude version, then it's brought out to more sophisticated print. I've even seen it on a fire guard, which I came across in Exeter, New Hampshire, at the Museum of the American Revolution there amongst their collection. It's a cast iron fire guard from the early 1760s, showing showing Wolfe standing up, pointing towards the enemy. Now,
Wow.
this is something which is imported from England. This is something which is produced locally. So the point I'm really trying to make is that the death of Wolfe resonated as strongly in the region in which he'd kind of arrived to fight against the French in the interests of British North America, as it did back home. And of course, if you look at the North American press, the newspapers, which were extremely well established by this stage, every colony had its own newspaper. New York and Boston had several. They'd already been instrumental in publicizing the exploits of Robert Rogers, and they were to be simultaneously instrumental in covering in great detail every blow, every development at the siege of Quebec or the siege of Louisbourg. So by the time of his death, Wolfe was a very well-known figure in the North American colonies. Both Wolfe and Rogers were far better known, interestingly, than George Washington, which is something which I think would surprise a lot of contemporary North Americans.
I can see that, though, obviously given the future history, but I can see why Washington might fly under the radar, and obviously Wolfe and Robert Rogers they're going to almost achieve celebrity status through this rise of this transatlantic media establishment.
Yeah, well, I've suggested, I think in Paths of Glory, I think I did say that you could make a good case that Wolfe was the first genuinely transatlantic celebrity, because Rogers he was certainly a celebrity in North America, and his reports were published by newspapers in Britain, because there was a lot of basically plagiarism. People would just pick up the juiciest tidbits from whatever, but it would take several months before a report from Rogers, which had been used in Boston or New York, makes its way across the Atlantic and appears in the Edinburgh or London newspapers. Whereas Wolfe was getting pretty much celebrity level coverage on both sides of the Atlantic, because British officers were writing home, although there was still a time delay, because Wolfe was a British officer, that the British general, the press had far more interest in these large-scale operations than in some interesting but minor skirmishes.
The volume of correspondence was just at a different level compared with.
And this is something which certainly is a great tool for historians looking at this area, because now a lot of these newspapers are available or can be searched online, particularly if you have a subscription, or your institution, I should say, has a subscription to one of these major companies that has collections of every known surviving newspaper from that era. I mean, this is something which has revolutionized research, because previously, if you wanted to, I'm old enough to remember the days of going to an institution, having to go through microfilms, which is a laborious process and so time consuming. And there's no search facility. You can't just type in St. Francis or Rogers or Wolfe just to narrow down the search. You've got to literally go through reel after reel after reel. But now, of course, because of the internet, and you can be I could be sitting here in Amsterdam, accessing a website, punching in a couple of names, and up they come. But yeah, it's a period of very, very rapid change at the moment, and it's still going on as more sources come online. But not everything does, and this is the point I've made before, that really you still have to go, if you really want to find offbeat stuff, you've still got to go to the archives, because the most obvious stuff is the stuff that gets digitized first, like the correspondence of George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. All of that can be searched online. If you want to find information on people they interacted with who aren't as famous, you've still got to go to the archives, and often in the archives, when you're looking for something, you end up finding something else, and it's something else which is the most interesting thing.
Yes, it opens up a whole new journey, a whole new path. Absolutely.
You go down the rabbit hole, but it takes you to something which I personally find far more interesting or revealing, because it's not the obvious thing, but within that less obvious package of documents will be the previously unknown account of an episode, and it's there because it's been misfiled, or because the clerk who originally put it all together didn't understand its significance, or because it involved someone who subsequently became very famous but who wasn't famous at the time, like George Washington.
I truly appreciate you translating, what it takes to be a historian in the field, for my students, because it's constantly, a struggle to translate that from the classroom to actual field work and what it takes to be, a historian to, a young budding student who's interested in the discipline.
Yeah, but
now,
sorry, William, I just quickly at a point now, you talk about the students. Now, I think it's far easier for students to interact with good primary source material without having to get a fellowship to go and stay in London or San Marino or whatever. The point I'm really making is that there is a limit to where that information can take you. It doesn't tick all of the boxes. I think even with the technology we now live with and have become accustomed to, is old school archival research still has its value. That's the point I'm really making.
You got it. Kids out there, you got to go to the source. Now, we've spoken in length about the French and Indian War, and I'd like to move on to George Washington now, because we will, slowly transition to the Revolution. Now, George Washington bridges, that time period, and he is a major participant, in both eras. So, your book, George Washington, Gentleman Warrior, really focuses on how he is shaped by these experiences early on, and how he develops this ethos based on these unique circumstances that he finds himself in. One leg in the old world, one leg in the new world. So by 1754, this young George Washington is given a pretty important assignment on the frontier. Why is he chosen for this mission, and how is he partnering with Native allies?
Yeah, George Washington, of course, is a very interesting character for all manner of reasons. But one of the things I tried to focus on when I looked at him was, I paid particular attention to his early years because I was interested in, where did he come from? Why did he achieve this subsequent celebrity? And of course, it all goes back to the 1750s. And you say, why was he chosen to go on this mission initially in winter of 1753-54 to go into the Ohio country where the French are coming in, and from the point of view of the Brits, encroaching upon what they see as their territory. So Washington basically goes on his mission to warn them off, which means going hundreds of miles across the Appalachians into this hazardous zone where you need to be pretty tough to even get there in the first place. And so Washington puts himself forward for this job because he's very ambitious, and he's someone who he knows the frontier to a certain extent because his Washington's family basically is sort of minor gentry who've been in America, who've been in Virginia, I should say, since the mid 17th century. But it's only in the 1740s where, because George's half brother Lawrence marries into a much more influential local family, the Fairfaxes, Washington gets a kind of a leg up. Not only does he start mixing with people from a higher social status, better connected, but he's given the opportunity to go and survey land on the frontier, and which means that he has his first acquaintance with native peoples on the frontier, and he also becomes aware of the potential of the frontier. And Washington becomes, because of his skill as a surveyor, becomes very interested in acquiring land for himself. But basically, by 1753, he has got a skill set. Not only is he someone who's of a quite a high status background, who's able to interact with French officers, French high commanders, because he knows, he's not some rough-hewn frontiersman. He's someone who has the ability to move in polite society, which is very important.
Yes.
Dealing with old school French officers. And also, unusually, he also has a certain amount of frontier skills. And he's accompanied by people like Christopher Gist, who, by no means a rough-hewn figure himself, had far greater knowledge of the frontier than Washington. So Washington has to go to Williamsburg and basically present himself to Governor Robert Dinwiddie, put himself up for the job. And he goes on this mission. And as a result of fulfilling this mission, although he doesn't convince the French to leave, as if anyone thought he ever would, he does show that he's demonstrated hardship, and he publishes, Dinwiddie actually swiftly publishes Washington's account, his diary of his expedition, his journey, which becomes something of a hit on both sides of the Atlantic, and it brings Washington's name into the public eye. And this underpins the subsequent decision to send Washington at the head of a small military expedition to actually physically eject the French from the forks of the Ohio rivers, where they are by this stage establishing a fortification.
Now, we know his mission goes a bit sideways,
Yeah.
to say the least. But how did this experience, prep him for, later and greater things, with a greater command under, with the Continental Army? And how did this experience kind of endear him to the Continental Congress later on, when they're again, looking for a candidate to, lead this military expedition?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Washington's command in 1754 does go somewhat awry, but basically, just to try and encapsulate it, he goes to try and warn off the French encroachment, and he comes up against a party led by Ensign Jumonville, and that party is essentially surprised and defeated with several casualties, including Jumonville himself. And this is seen as an overreaction, basically, as an act of hostility in what is basically a time of peace. Historians sometimes refer to it as kind of like the opening shot of what would become the war. And according to recent research by David Preston, who has written a very good book on Braddock's defeat, the evidence suggests it was Washington himself who actually fired the very first shot. So what this does is this kind of stirs up a kind of a hornet's nest, really. And so a larger party of French, including the brother of the slain Ensign Jumonville, come in search of vengeance. And Washington holds up in a stockade known as Fort Necessity, which has since been reconstructed. And a party of French militia and native warriors descend upon Fort Necessity in July of 1754. And there's a kind of a short standoff, short siege. Ultimately, Washington has to surrender, or does surrender, and marches off. So it's rather an ignominious end to his campaign. But despite this fact, because Washington had put up quite a stout resistance against the odds, he nonetheless, the Virginia Assembly thanks him for his services. He's seen as a man on the make who's determined, he's brave. He, of course, looks the part, acts the part. And
yes, very important.
And this is really what I was trying to explore in Gentleman Warrior, the subtitle of my book. But this is what I think how he saw himself. And so he becomes, when General Braddock comes over in 1755 with the British, because of Washington's track record, he's taken on as an unofficial aide de camp to Braddock. And when Braddock's expedition is catastrophically defeated near the forks of the Ohio, the Battle of the Monongahela, Washington manages to come out of it with an enhanced reputation, having distinguished himself amongst the chaos. And again, when Virginia decides it needs a regiment to defend its frontiers, in the wake of Braddock's defeat, it's Washington who becomes colonel of that provincial regiment, in which he commands until the end of 1758, at which stage he basically resigns from military life and goes into politics, goes into the Virginia Assembly. But when, in 1775, when Congress, after hostilities commenced between Britain and the colonies, when the Continental Congress should say, is looking for a commander, who do you go for? There are various candidates, but there's not really someone who combines being American born, unlike Horatio Gates, for example, who settled in America but's British born, or Charles Lee, who settled in America but British born, or has the distinguished military credentials and the appearance. There's no. I mean, what people say that Washington, he didn't really want to be commander of the Continental Army, but why would he turn up in Philadelphia wearing his old Continentals? Why wear your old Virginia regiment uniform, in which he's famously depicted in the first portrait by Charles Wilson Peele, which I think again is 1770. Why be pictured wearing that? Why turn up at Congress wearing it unless you actually want that job? That's how he wanted to be seen.
I mean, he seems, from what you're addressing here, he seems to have a quality of, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, or turning defeats around to his advantage somehow. He seems to be able to learn, adapt, and develop. And there's a similar process playing out at the beginning of the Revolution under his command, with these major defeats starting in the Battle of Brooklyn. But somehow, some way, he's able to turn this around into some sort of positive outcome.
Yeah, well, of course, with Washington, and again, this is something that interested me when I looked at his career. Yeah, he'd had this experience back in the 1750s, but fighting relatively small scale warfare on the frontier, wasn't really comparable at all to taking on a full-sized European style army, which was well trained and actually quite well led, to be honest, in 1775. I mean, Washington, of course, he succeeds in boxing the British up in Boston, and the British evacuate Boston, but they come back from Nova Scotia, and when they come back, they're not messing around. So when they land on Long Island, Washington really, unsurprisingly, is completely out of his depth. He hasn't really got any. He thinks he's going to get another Bunker Hill type situation where you dig in and the Brits will obligingly just march up the hill with fixed bayonets, and you inflict such heavy casualties that they don't want to do it again. But of course, on Long Island at Brooklyn Heights, he's completely outclassed by that night march, which outflanks him, and it's a defeat. But he manages to salvage enough from that defeat, again, because the British aren't really acting with enough of a killer instinct. And I won't go into the reason for that, but there's all kinds of theories why they did or they didn't go in for the kill on that occasion, but they didn't. So it does allow a breathing space. And then you have the various battles for New York, the British landing on Manhattan, gradually pushing Washington off of Manhattan Island. He's pushed back through New Jersey, across the Delaware. Of course, by this stage, the British are getting a little bit lackadaisical. People are going into winter quarters. There's Washington on the other side of the Delaware. And of course, in the last days of 1776, first days of 1777, he mounts this extraordinary riposte with the battles of Trenton, Princeton, which by any stretch of the imagination is a remarkable campaign. And it really does save the Patriot cause, if I can call it that, when it was at its lowest ebb. And of course, the British are taken completely by surprise. They think it's by this stage pretty much over, and there'll just really be a case of going back in the spring and mopping things up. And so now you have to go back and start, not quite from scratch, but start from a very different level. So Washington does have the ability to learn. And there's this big debate about, well, was Washington a great general? You know, was he a Napoleon? Was he a Robert E. Lee? And of course, I don't think he was. But what I would say he was a great commander. He was a great leader. And being a great leader can go a long way in cushioning, compensating for the fact that you're not a supreme strategist or general. If you're a good enough leader, you can compensate for those other flaws because you can bounce back. And also you can learn on the job. I mean, if we look at in 1777, Washington's defeated heavily again at Brandywine, but by this point, defeat doesn't mean potential disaster. You've developed enough, or you've learned enough that you've covered certain bases, so you can stage a withdrawal. And not long afterwards, he actually mounts a very ambitious attack on the British at Germantown, which is almost like Trenton. Up again, of course, that doesn't work for various reasons. But even the British by that stage saying, "Oh, okay, that was pretty. It was pretty close call. If it had been better coordinated, or if the troops had been better disciplined, or if there hadn't been missed, or if there hadn't been a kind of a blue-on-blue friendly fire incident, it could have turned out rather differently." But of course, that's all what if. But of course, then by the stage of Monmouth, the Battle of Monmouth, 1778. By which stage the Continental Army has gone through Valley Forge and his whole drill has been overhauled. You have far more of a standoff situation, and that's the last big battle in the north, because after that things get kind of stalemated. So the British opportunity to defeat Washington, knock him out, was really summer of 1776, and I think he enjoyed a lot of luck at that stage. But of course, luck is itself a part of warfare, isn't it? So,
and not everyone would. I don't think another person might have even been able to follow up on their so-called luck in the manner that he did. He just seemed to have a knack. If you gave him an opportunity, you gave him another shot, he would just come right back. And he would learn, he would develop, and he would come right back and hit you.
Yeah, and this is why I think that you need to draw a distinction between generalship and leadership. And if you can combine enough of both, there are plenty of great leaders out there, or who weren't great strategists, and you've got plenty of great strategists who lacked the kind of moral fiber, if you like. I don't know. I think Washington is one of those people who actually did have a kind of a blend of both qualities, and I think also he did have the ability to learn. And one of the things that struck me when I was researching my book about him, or trying to come up with new angles, really, was the fact that by the time the French got involved in the war, they had no qualms about deferring to Washington, which is extraordinary when you think, these are people who often the officers were aristocrats who came from a very different background. But I think, again, because Washington did know how to tell the difference between, claret and Madeira, he did know how to ride a horse properly, he dressed in the right way. They could sense that he themselves
could bridge that gap.
Was a gentleman. This is again why I tried to home in on this gentleman warrior aspect. I think it really was very important. And of course, by the time people like Lafayette arrive on the scene, Rochambeau arrive on the scene, by the time the Yorktown campaign takes place, you have the French acting alongside the Continental Army as kind of allies, rather than trying to say, "Oh no, we're the professionals." So yeah, I think Washington did learn, and he learned on the job under the most difficult conditions. If he had made a mistake, or if he hadn't reacted as he did back in the winter of 1776-77, things would have been very different.
Well, speaking of the difference between leadership, strategist, tactical acumen, I want to transition to the last work here, the last few minutes, and that's Turncoat: Benedict Arnold and the Crisis in American liberty. So I want to, how would you compare, starting off with that leadership, versus tactical strategy, how would you compare Benedict Arnold to Washington? Did he have those same leadership qualities? Was he a better tactician? How would you compare the two?
Well, it's interesting that John Fortescue, who was a famous British historian, late 19th, early 20th century, perhaps most famous for his multi-volume history of the British Army. When he looked at the Revolutionary War, he said that the most formidable, effective American commander was Benedict Arnold, which is quite a claim. Now, he made that claim on the basis of Arnold being the best tactician, the best leader, and the best natural combat officer, if you like, someone who had the ability to sense, right, this is the moment we need to attack. This is what we should do. And it's someone who, although his background wasn't as a soldier, he was one of these people who had instinctive military capabilities. Now, going back to your original point, was he how would you rate him as a leader, as a tactician? I think he was a very effective leader. I mean, there's no doubt about his leadership abilities. This was something Washington himself recognized from very early on, particularly the appointment of Arnold to lead the expedition against Quebec through the Maine wilderness in late 1775. This was something which he executed in a hardest of conditions, got to his objective, launched on the final night of 1775, launched this epic attack on Quebec along with General Montgomery during a snowstorm, is wounded for his pains. This was when he still had the rank of colonel. And Washington writes him a letter afterwards, basically full of praise. And Washington is really impressed by Arnold's leadership qualities. And of course, we know Washington isn't someone who gives praise lightly. As a result of this, that Washington is promoted to brigadier general by Congress. The big problem that happens with Arnold afterwards is that as brigadier, when the British in 1777 attack Connecticut, Arnold's leadership abilities are then very much in evidence, where he kind of rallies the militia, even though he doesn't really like the militia very much, rallies the militia and turns back the British attempt. There's this standoff at Ridgefield where Arnold is famously has his horse shot from under him and he's trapped beneath the horse. Redcoat advances on him as if to skewer him with his bayonet. Arnold pulls a pistol from his saddle holster, shoots down the Redcoat, not only extricates himself from under this dead horse, but stops to unbuckle the saddle, slings it over his shoulder, and coolly walks away, which the British themselves write about as a very intrepid act. Of course,
and that's not the first time he's going to be pinned underneath the horse either. So.
No, but then of course, if we just zoom forward, I mean, as a result of that, he's belatedly promoted to Major General. But what happens is his ranking in the list of Major Generals means that he's superseded by other officers who've seen nothing like his combat experience, who in fact have done hardly anything. And we haven't even mentioned Arnold's role in 1776 at the Battle of Valcour Island, which, I mean, just very, very quickly, I would argue that was something which saved the cause, the revolutionary cause, in 1776, when Washington had just been defeated in New York. The British were out, although the British did advance from Canada, but they never got down to the end of, further than the end of the southern end of Lake Champlain, because of the delay that Arnold's resistance with his ramshackle fleet had actually created. But anyway,
so he's got this merchant marine background, though, right? That kind of prepares him. He's an admiral. He's a general on the battlefield. he can seemingly do it all.
Yeah, well, because of his career as a merchant captain in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, where he had gone all the way through that transatlantic British world. You know, he'd been down to the Isthmus of Panama. He'd been to Amsterdam, where I am now. He'd been to London, which is pretty unusual for people of his background. And he traded through the Caribbean. He'd been to Quebec. He'd taken horses overland from the English colonies across frozen Lake George, Lake Champlain. And these are pretty remarkable achievements. So he knew the ground, and he was actually someone who had been around. And he's, you know, by the time he was in his early 30s, he was someone who'd seen the world and had already done a lot.
He was very, very familiar then with the frontiers of New York and Quebec, and
he was. I mean,
northern New England.
He was someone who had that kind of world experience, if you like. And by the time he'd fought the Battle of Valcour, and by the time he'd fought at Ridgefield, then, you know, ultimately he does get promoted to Major General. But as I mentioned, because of the way the system worked, he was down the line of ranking, so to speak, of the supremacy, superiority. Seniority, sorry, that's the word I was looking for. So by the Saratoga campaign of summer, autumn 77, hasn't got what he considers to be his seniority within the army. So this is a big kind of gripe for him. But during the two kind of battlefield engagements, Freeman's Farm, so-called Bemis Heights, although they're fought over much the same ground, they're distinguished by these two different names. Both occasions, he played an important role. In the first battle, I think it's fairly well recognised that Arnold was instrumental in actually getting the troops forward, his division forward, into the firing line. And that was something he wasn't given, well, he was given very little acknowledgement for by General Gage.
That kind of leads into my next question. We talk about Saratoga being, the high point of his career. How did that denial of credit, really kind of push him towards treason?
Well, by this stage, Arnold's already very disgruntled by the fact his role in the first Battle of Saratoga isn't acknowledged. By the second battle, Bemis Heights, where Arnold plays this, key role in actually taking the redoubt at the extreme right of of Burgoyne's line, and in the process, he suffers a crippling leg wound. By this stage, then he's people are saying, well, yeah, his role is being recognised, but I think the damage, both mental and physical, has already been done, and it's in this period after October 1777, because Arnold isn't around to see the surrender of Burgoyne's army. He isn't there to gain the glory. He's not included in the famous Trumbull painting of.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah,
even though that was painted much later, post treason, I don't think he would have been included anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
Might have been included sort of as a symbol, but by this stage, Arnold, who we know had been a very kind of physical, athletic kind of character, he's crippled. At this stage, Congress still hasn't changed his seniority in the line of major generals. I think this is the crucial period where he starts to think, am I on the right side here? Or put it another way, is Congress on my side? Is Congress actually, do they appreciate me? And so if we move forward to when Arnold is appointed military commandant of Philadelphia in 1778, after the British evacuate, he's in an environment where he comes up against the most extreme radical supporters of the revolution, who he has very little in common with, the executive council of Philadelphia, who they look at Arnold and they say, well, here's this soldier arrogant. He kind of despises the civilians who haven't been out at the sharp end like he has. They think he's, too favourable towards the people they see as loyalists, disposed towards the loyalist cause. So you have a combination of factors, and then basically he gets caught up in these niggling little arguments about settling his finances from the Quebec campaign of 1775. Where's the accounts from 1776? Well, actually, they got burned when, during the Battle of Valcour Island. Where am I supposed to find them from? But the kind of pen pushers in Congress don't see it that way. They say, well, what happened to those thousands of dollars? Where are they? I mean, can we, this guy. And so, because there were several individuals who actually seemed to be pursuing personal vendettas against Arnold. I mean, he seems to have been one of these people who had the knack for rubbing certain people up the wrong way.
Yeah.
His own character, he was one of these people also who was convinced that he was right. And a
He
phrase
had that high sense of honor that, like, if that was violated, it was that was the the boiling point for him, and he lost it.
He fought duels as a young man and also in his later years. And this phrase that comes up again and again in his correspondence is conscience of the rectitude of my behavior. Basically, I'm right, you're wrong. And who are you to disparage me, my sense of honor? Yeah, I mean, he was someone who thought he'd earned his, if he was rich, he'd earned it. And he had, in terms of, if he ended up as one of the richest people in New Haven in 1775, it's because he'd been out since a young age, plying back and forth through storms, God knows, snow, whatever. He'd worked very hard for his wealth and for his status and for having one of the largest homes in New Haven. Similarly, this sense of honor was something he shared with George Washington. This idea of I am against, and what again, ironically, given how things panned out, he always believed that he was acting in an honourable way. And I would suggest, and I argue in Turncoat that, ironically as it might seem, Arnold changed his coat from blue to red because he thought he was acting in an honourable way. He thought that by doing so, he would end what had actually become this kind of morass of a bloody civil war. And of course, his thinking is of someone who'd always seen the French as he'd grown up in a world in which the French were the enemy, not the British. And, I think particularly once the French entered the war, ironically, as a result of Saratoga, he began to see things rather differently. It's a slow process. It didn't happen overnight, but by the time he actually approached the British, which was in early 1779, spring of 1779, so it didn't happen overnight, he was starting to think, well, actually, this cause to which I signed up, to which I sacrificed my wealth and my health, perhaps isn't the right cause after all. And from that point onwards, he decided that he needs to end the conflict. And of course, the way things pan out, the British initially are extremely suspicious of this. They can't believe that their most formidable battlefield opponent after Washington is actually offering his services to them. And this is the flaw in the whole final plan to deliver up West Point. It's because the way they can be definitely sure that this is Arnold is to send someone, Major Andre, to physically meet them. And it's when Major Andre goes up the Hudson, meets with Arnold, discusses the finer details of the plan, and then it comes back and it's then captured when he's almost home and dry, that the whole thing unravels. It came very, very close to succeeding.
Yes. And just to end the conversation, because I know our time frame, if West Point had been handed over, would that have been the death knell for the revolution? Would that have put a nail in the coffin?
Yeah, I think what we've got to remember here, it wasn't just West Point that was going to be handed over, the plot was timed to go off at the same time that Washington was visiting.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So West Point, of course, was a highly priced strategic objective because it commanded the choke point in the Hudson River. That, you know, the thinking was, if you commanded West Point, you commanded the Hudson. If you commanded the Hudson, you split the colonies between New England and the colonies to the south. But so that was a big enough thing. But if you also bagged Washington, I would argue that by 1780, Washington was pretty much the revolution. Without Washington,
Okay.
there
He's
wasn't
embodied
really
the entire
But with
cause.
people, you know, you have people like Nathaniel Greene, his second in command, who theoretically could have picked up the traces. But I think the psychological impact of eliminating Washington, alongside the strategic impact of taking West Point, would have been a kind of a double blow that, even if it didn't end the conflict, I think would have brought Congress to some kind of negotiating situation. Because you've got to remember also that by the summer of 1780, the Patriot cause was at low ebb. Congress was full of mediocrities compared to what it had been like in 1776. Morale in the Continental Army was extremely low. There'd already been some mutinies, there'll be more.
Mm-hmm.
The devaluation of the dollar, there was a lot of disillusionment. And people forget, because looking back from a kind of a Yorktown perspective, they forget that just a year earlier, things have been very, very different. So I think that, yeah, even if it hadn't resulted in an outright British victory, I think what would have happened would have been a negotiated settlement whereby, for example, the British kept Canada and maybe the southern colonies. And maybe, to simplify things, the British had things below or to the south of that Hudson split. And
so there definitely would have been some sort of negotiations. There
would have been some kind of like a Commonwealth status whereby, and this is interestingly, Arnold had always suggested, you know, prior to 1763, things had been okay, but it was the program of sort of tyrannical attempts to change the relationship, which had caused him to support the revolutionary cause. If there'd been a situation that had gone back to something closer to 1763, where everyone was reasonably happy, then, of course, then the American colonies would have been retained as part of that British Atlantic Empire. I think they might have been given a kind of a slightly different status where they had more autonomy, more control over their own. But I think they could have been part of a broader. Anyway, that's a great what if, but I don't think that's unlikely.
Well, I definitely could see some sort of agreement along the original intentions of the Howe brothers originally in 76 with their peace commissions, something along that line. But I just want to thank you so much, because we come to an end with our time here, and I truly appreciate you. Like I said, it's the most valuable resource you have, and the fact that you've donated it to the show today and to the people of New York and Quebec, and of course our AP students listening in. I truly appreciate your time and your effort today. It will definitely help promote a great local cause. And for yourself, I look forward to meeting you in person. I'll be at the Ticonderoga conference in September, so we'll definitely get to meet in person then.
Well, I'll look forward to that very much, William, and I also wanted to thank you for having me on, and also for asking such kind of pertinent questions, because, you know, I think they allowed us to cover a lot of ground, and hopefully the kind of topics we did, you know, tackle a lot of different topics. Absolutely. And hopefully the threads we raised will help stimulate your own students. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, and you have a great rest of your weekend and enjoy. And we'll be in touch. I'll email you. And one last thing: are you working on anything new at the moment?
Well, I've got several ideas, and I've been doing a lot of other things. One of the things I've done, I mean, I also write book reviews for the Wall Street Journal on, you know, all kinds of historical topics. which takes up a fair bit of my time. I've also been working as a sort of a historical tour guide.
Okay.
The last one I did was actually on the Revolutionary War, but that, of course, that's only a couple of weeks a year. Been working on some articles. I don't actually have a book underway, although I had several ideas. And of course, with the big anniversary of the revolution, 250th anniversary of the,
Yes.
I have been thinking about certain things, but then so many people are doing things that it's so difficult to come up with an original, fresh topic. So I've been looking at other things, but the paper I'm given at the Ticonderoga conference involves an individual and involves themes which I might try and develop into a bigger project, but we'll see. Hopefully by the time I get to give my paper at the conference in September, I'll be a lot further ahead with that research and I'll have a better idea about whether it would be viable, but we'll see.
Well, I guess I'll ask you the question again in September. I appreciate it very much. And again, the best to you and your family, and you have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too, William. Thank you very much again. I really enjoyed talking to you.